مرحبا وأهلا بكم في برنامج داخل واشنطن. معكم مضيفكم روبرت ساتلوف. هذا فصل الصيف من جديد في واشنطن. درجة الحرارة مرتفعة. الكونغرس في عطلة. فريقنا للبيسبول هو الأفضل في الدوري الوطني، والرئيس يلعب الغولف من جديد. ماذا يمكن أن يكون أفضل من ذلك؟ فصل الصيف فرصة للتمهل ومراجعة بعض أهم خصوص العام، ومن الواضح أن الانتخاب المفاجئ لدونالد ترامب يتصدر القائمة، ويرتبط بذلك دراما الحرب الباردة التي خيمت على الانتخابات، وخاصة دور روسيا في محاولة تقويض العملية الديمقراطية في بلادنا. ولكن توجد خصوصا أخرى كذلك تستحق الاهتمام، بداية من إعادة تشكيل ملامح سياسة أمريكا الخارجية في عهد رئيسنا الجديد، ووصولا إلى الصمود المدهش لإصلاح الرئيس أوباما لنظام الرعاية الصحية، والذي قاد دونالد ترامب حملته الانتخابية ضده وفاز بالرئاسة. فيما يلي مقاطعة من لقاءات سابقة مع خبرائنا سلطت الضوء على بعض أهم القضايا التي ما تزال تتصدر الأجندة السياسية اليوم. Let me just ask at least a glass half full question. Do you gentlemen think that we will in fact succeed in driving Daesh, ISIS out of Iraq sometime in the foreseeable future?
Yes. Yes. So we're making enough investments there that that is probable to inevitable. But it stops at the Syrian border. And you can't expect your Kurd allies to go beyond the Kurdish territory to finish the job for you.
I mean, the great hope against ISIS, without being too catastrophic about the vision, is that you do have allies with common interests and common goals, in a sense, maybe with different interests long-term, but short-term, an interest to dislodge ISIS. And so in the Iraqi context, it's the central government, it's some Sunni allies, it's obviously the Shia, and of course the Kurds. And so there's enough of a sense of
let me ask you about this.
But I did want to point this out, Rob, not disallowing your question, but a key question in Iraq, beyond can you dislodge this group, is what happens afterward. We're seeing this in places like Ramadi, where ISIS has basically destroyed infrastructure. And so it's physically what happens next, and then politically what happens next. And to Peter's point, even if you have an immediate alignment of interests, the long-term questions of political viability of Iraq, the interests of Sunni, Shia, Kurdish, and other forces play out in Iraq, and then they play out in Syria as well.
Let me ask you about prioritizing countries, in the sense that should we care more about the state of human rights in an adversary or in an ally, in a big country with, that plays a big role in the world stage, or smaller, lesser important countries with less of strategic significance in the world stage?
Look, I mean, I personally am against saying that, okay, we should ignore human rights issues in a country that's important to us, and we should use it as a weapon to bludgeon people who we see as our adversaries. I think the United States has a lot to say about countries that are our allies, and we should be saying this. There are a number of countries in the Middle East that are close allies, also are serious human rights abusers, and I believe we should hold those countries to account. I also believe that in countries like Iran, where we have a nuclear deal, right, and want to protect that nuclear deal, we shouldn't shove human rights to the side and pretend that that's not a problem. I mean, in a country that is probably the third most prolific executor of its own citizens, in the world. I think these are important issues that we should bring up. So I believe personally that the United States, while it can't change people's internal politics, it can't always have a major effect on human rights violations. It has a moral obligation and a foreign policy obligation to speak up on these, you know, whatever country it happens to be.
And in your experience, how candid do you think administrations of both parties have been in both dealing with, say, adversaries with whom we have strategic issues, like China, and friends with whom we have close partnerships?
Well, look, I think in some of these countries we have been more vocal in public about human rights violations because it's seen to be a strategic tool that we can use. And as I just said, I don't think that's necessarily the right approach in every case. I think that you know, we should be speaking out in some of these countries. And what you will often hear from U.S. officials is that, oh, we raise these concerns in private. That's the best way to do it. And what my experience been, it has not always been the best way to do it, because a lot of these countries listen to what you say in public, and that is often more impactful than what you say in private. The other point that I'd like to raise here is that I think saying things in public to these countries, whether we have strategic interests with them, whether they're enemies, has an impact on the people in those countries who are working for human rights, fighting for human rights, and sometimes dying or being imprisoned for their work. They like to know that the United States, and others, of course, have not abandoned their causes, and that gives them strength in what they're trying to do, carrying their work forward. So I do think that's very important.
So people in these countries are really listening to what the State Department Human Rights reports say, what the spokesman says. It matters.
It does matter. You know, it does matter. And I've heard this from activists in a number of countries when I was working on, for example, Egypt, Tunisia, and other places. And what, you know, they have said is that they want to hear from the United States. I mean, obviously the United States in many cases doesn't have a great reputation. We're considered imperialists. We're doing this and that and the other thing. But we are also seen as an advocate for a lot of the right principles and ideas. And civil society activists who are being imprisoned want to hear that the United States supports them. I mean, it's also very important to them to hear that the European Union and other democracies support them. But the United States is a very powerful voice and can use that voice in international fora, I think, more effectively to make this case.
There was a time when universities were the source of great ideas for government and for public policy. That has waned in the last couple of decades, and the rise of research institutions, think tanks. Right. Do you see a comeback for universities? Do you see this gelling?
I think it needs to be. I think universities are under two kinds of pressure. So one is external, and you know, if you're the president of a university, you have lots of constituencies, you have donors, and this notion of connecting to society, which by the way is everything from the local level, Durham, North Carolina, which has lots of social and educational issues, all the way up to the global. And I think there's a greater sense that universities and university presidents would do well to go back to the era in which they were big public intellectuals, University of Chicago, Harvard, and others. Terry Sanford, the president of Duke, was very much both in the political world but also seen as a public intellectual. Within universities, you have the demands of, I mean, you mentioned the book I wrote on Iraq before, back in the early 1990s, and when I published that book, my publisher said to me, is this a love letter to your colleagues or for the rest of us to read? And it was the latter, and therefore they published it. There's too much love letter to colleagues going on in universities. And I think we as universities are incredibly important institutions. I think we have responsibility to connect to society. Think tanks like the Washington Institute for Near East Policy are fabulous, but I think that universities need to do that too.
So Bruce, as I explained, this show beams out to the Middle East, millions of Arab viewers trying to understand how our system works. You've seen our system from the inside out, and sometimes it doesn't work. So if you had a magic wand and you could repair, fix, correct something about our foreign policy making system, what would that be?
Just one.
Just one.
Not like 3 wishes for
No,
the
you
magic
get one
lamp,
wish.
just one wish.
One wish.
You know, I think I would really encourage presidents to be more of a public educator, if you will, to give people, in the academic world they call them paradigms, in the political communication worlds they call them frames. Americans are under a lot of uncertainty and anxiety now about the way the world is changing in every sense, right? And I think they really need help to sort of have a sense, realistic, which isn't just self-glorification, of what the 21st century era is like, you know, what our role is, how it can help them, and a little reassurance that, you know, that we've gone through bad periods before, not as if everything was great before. That would allow a president to be, you know, even more of a leader, which in turn would allow them, I think, to have a little bit more sway over Congress, because Congress is responsive to public opinion. So I actually think helping people understand what's going on is like, you know, a key that then opens lots of doors for you. So that would be, if I could do one thing, that would be my one thing.
Specifically about the military buildup that the president has suggested. Some experts suggest that we should focus on manpower training, readiness, the ability to project force. Others suggest that we need to have greater capital investments, especially more ships for the longer term. Where do you strike the balance here?
I don't think we have a choice but to do all of it. Our disinvestment over the last several years has put us in a much weaker position. We don't have the readiness among our personnel we should have. The people we send over there are ready, but we don't have enough people behind them who have the readiness. And so we have longer deployments, which is really harming our ability to be an effective fighting force. A lot of our equipment is wearing out and is becoming outdated. When you look at what our adversaries are doing technologically, we're not keeping up with them. And so in order for us to be the power that we are, not just here in this hemisphere, but around the world, we're going to have to invest in all of it. That's going to be hard to do. But I think it's necessary and I think it's doable. It's only doable if we continue to work with our allies in the Middle East, in Asia, in the Pacific, in Central and South America, and understand that we're now working as a part of a bigger group. While we may be the leader in some of those groups, we're working with that group and try to bring their resources in to help us as well. That's beginning to happen, and I think our buildup in our defense will take several years before it really reaches where we want to get it. But I'm confident we're going to get there, and I think we're taking the necessary steps to do that. We've been destructive in some cases. We need to engage constructively.
Let me ask you about sort of domestic culture and society.
Right.
A number of issues that people didn't necessarily expect emerged on the national scene this year. One was the relationship between law enforcement and essentially urban life, Black America.
Mass incarceration, race.
Second, mass incarceration.
Poverty.
A third, transgender issues. Caitlyn Jenner
Right.
transformed how people think about this. Another one is how Planned Parenthood became a controversial topic. What wild cards could there be out there on the domestic political scene?
Well, one thing, you know, if we getting back to letdowns, but I think this is an issue that's going to be an even more dominant one, is guns. Every time we have an incident where you have assault weapons and massive armaments used, that people who on the surface shouldn't be able to have easy access to them get them. We get another uprising. How can we possibly do this? And then almost nothing happens. I suspect we're going to see a lot more of that in the year ahead.
One of the early initiatives you were involved with was helping Afghan rebels, the Mujahideen, against the Soviets. This is another episode where people either learn lessons or overlearn lessons. What do you think the right lessons were from that experience?
Well, the big lesson is that when you're you become involved in something big, like taking on the Soviets in a war in Afghanistan, don't assume at the beginning that you know the end. Because there are several outcomes that are possible, and keep an open mind and adapt. What we assumed at the beginning when I got into government was something reasonable but turned out to be wrong, which is that the Soviets would prevail in Afghanistan. That was the dominant assumption. And so we did not think about post-Soviet Afghanistan because we didn't believe there would be a post-Soviet Afghanistan. And therefore, the groups that we supported was not informed by the post-Soviet Afghanistan calculations. And therefore, we did support some undesirable groups in retrospect. And our second sort of problem, although we achieved a great success, Afghanistan helped increase Soviet problems led to Soviet disintegration, which was a great geopolitical victory for the United States. But by disengaging after the Soviet withdrew, by not adapting quickly enough to put a government together in Afghanistan, a civil war broke out, and that the Taliban emerged as victorious at the end, and then made an alliance with Al-Qaeda. So the lesson is keep an open mind about outcomes, adapt as the circumstances change, do not disengage, although engagement has costs, but disengagement can be even more expensive, and those would be the lessons of the 1980s in Afghanistan for me.
Who's the most impressive foreign policy practitioner that you've dealt with in your 30 years?
Of course, Henry Kissinger, in my judgment, combined uniquely thought, strategy, conceptualization, and implementation. I think he was uniquely impressive. I think there are others who have been quite impressive in terms of managing complex processes in times of war. I thought that Secretary of Defense Cheney, as Secretary of Defense, did an extremely good job.
You mean the first Gulf War?
The first Gulf War. And also Secretary Baker, his counterpart, did a great job of putting a coalition together. I thought that those three people in different roles were impressive in actually executing. Some in execution, some in both conceptualization and execution.
More generally, Pentagon, not always known as an institution that is nimble and embraces change so easily.
Right.
Amazing technology, speed of change.
Right.
How does this clash work? Is it working?
So, what's odd is that back in the 1950s, about 2/3 of U.S. research and development money into scientific and technical research came from the military. Today, it's reversed. 2/3 comes from the private sector. Only about 1/3 comes from the military. The military, under Ash Carter, is rushing to the private sector, to Silicon Valley and other labs around the world to try and seize some of that innovative spirit. But here's what the military can do that these guys can't. They can design or come up with a program that's going to be 10 years out. So they don't have to answer to the same market dynamics, to investors that want their money next month in the same way that Silicon Valley does. So there's actually, with the amount of money we give them and the importance of their work, there's a lot of innovation they can do. it's just not always very apparent when you look at the stuff they actually do.
And so, on balance, when offered innovation, are they embracing it?
Some, the smart ones. You are also going to find some resistance. And you know what's weird is that it's the military, to the outside world, it looks like one, it's monolithic, it looks like one face. In fact, the disputes that go on behind closed doors are enormous, and they have consequences in the real world. So it's capable of innovation. It doesn't always achieve it.
Patrick Tucker, fascinating discussion. Thank you very much for joining us here on Dakhel, Washington. بهذا نصل إلى نهاية هذه الحلقة من برنامج داخل واشنطن. إذا كانت لديكم أي استفسارات أو تعليقات حول هذه الحلقة، وخاصة حول ما القضايا التي ستبرز كموضوعات رئيسية في النصف الثاني من 2017، أرجو أن تراسلوني مباشرة على عنوان البريد الإلكتروني التالي insidewashington@elhura.com. معكم روبرت ساتلوف. شكرا لكم وإلى اللقاء.